Hi, and welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
So today we're digging into some source material that you've actually sent our way. It looks like a mix of things, notes, some excerpts, translations too.
That's right. Both Telugu and English translations, yeah. And some reflections on, things we might have touched on before about this topic.
Okay. And the focus seems really, really specific this time. We're looking at the Bhagavad Gita, obviously a huge text, but zooming right in on, well, the very beginning of the Kurukshetra War description.
Exactly. The material guides us straight there. Not the whole epic, not even the whole Gita, really. It's about how certain warriors get introduced right at the start.
Right, when the scene is being set. And the sources are pointing us to one particular verse for this.
They are, consistently. It's all about verse 5.
Verse 5, okay. So our mission today, just so we're clear for everyone listening, is to stick only to what's in the source material you've provided. We want to pull out the key insights about the warriors mentioned in that specific verse, verse 5, and just understand who they are based purely on what these notes and translations tell us.
It's like a targeted intel briefing, you could say. Getting informed quickly and thoroughly, but only using the provided dossier.
I like that. Okay, so let's start with the context. Verse 5 of the Bhagavad Gita. What do the sources tell us about why this verse is important?
Well, they consistently frame it as the place where a list appears, a list of important warriors who are right there participating in the Kurukshetra War.
So it's presented as a kind of roll call, almost, at least for some key figures.
Something like that, yeah. The sources are basically saying, look here, this is where the text starts naming names, important names.
And you mentioned translations Telugu and English. They both cover this part.
Yes. And crucially, the sources point out that both translations, despite being in different languages, end up listing the same individuals from this verse.
Okay, that's good. It gives us confidence that we're looking at a well-defined group here, according to the sources.
Absolutely. It reinforces that there's a specific set of names being highlighted in verse 5 that our source material is focused on.
Now, what about how these individuals are described? Does the verse, or do the sources interpreting it, give them a general label?
Oh, definitely. This is a really key point the sources emphasize right away. The material states very clearly that verse 5 lists individuals who are identified as great heroes.
Great heroes.
Yes. The Telugu sources use the term Ananya, Gopavirulu, and the sources also bring in the Sanskrit term Mahaviras.
Mahaviras. Okay, so great heroes. That's a significant title to give someone right at the beginning of describing a massive war, isn't it?
It really is. And the sources argue that being included in this list, right here at the start, immediately signals their importance, their prominence on the battlefield.
It's like the text is saying, pay attention to these guys.
Precisely. The sources suggest that their inclusion in this initial enumeration, as the armies are being surveyed, marks them out as significant figures, top-tier warriors.
And the sources also mention looking back at previous conversations.
Yeah, they do reflect on that. They note that these specific individuals have come up before and were identified as great heroes based on this very material, this verse 5 listing.
So it's not just presenting the info, it's sort of confirming that, yes, this is a recognized list of important people drawn straight from this part of the Gita.
Exactly. The sources are building a case based strictly on what verse 5 says about this group.
All right, this is fascinating. Let's get into the names then. We should probably go through them one by one, based on how the sources present them from verse 5.
Sounds like a plan. And for each one, we should state the name, list every descriptor the sources apply to them from this verse.
Okay, every single one.
Yep. Confirm they're on this list in verse 5. Talk about what the sources say their inclusion means.
And, crucially, point out what the sources don't say, right? Keeping it tight to the material we have.
That's the discipline for this deep dive. Stick to the script, literally.
Okay. First name up from verse 5, according to our sources.
That would be Dagakatu. The sources spell it out.
Dagakatu.
And the descriptors. What labels do the sources attach to him from this verse?
They're very consistent here. He's repeatedly called a great hero, Bhagavad Gita, and also Mahavira de Kutakamite.
So unambiguous. Great hero, Mahavira. That's the label pinned on him specifically in relation to verse 5.
Absolutely. And the sources make another point he's not mentioned alone.
Ah, right. The context of the list itself.
Exactly. The sources emphasize he's listed alongside the others in verse 5. Jekitana, the heroic king of Kashi, Purujit, Kuntiboja, and Sebya. Being part of this group is highlighted.
So he's presented as one member of this initial cohort of significant warriors.
Mm-hmm. And his inclusion in this specific list, at this specific moment in the narrative, the very beginning of the war description, is what the sources point to as confirmation of his status.
His status as a prominent great hero. Yes. The act of naming him here with that great hero label is presented as the key evidence for his significance in this context.
Now, this is where sticking only to the sources gets really interesting. They call him a great hero based on this verse.
Right.
But do they give any, specific examples, any stories of his bravery or details about his fighting style?
No, they don't. And the sources are clear about this limitation within the material they're analyzing. They identify him as a great hero because he's on the list with that title in verse 5.
But that's it.
That's it, according to the provided text. No details on specific deeds, no background, nothing about his actual performance in battle. The focus for Diakatu in the context of verse 5, as presented by our sources, is purely his name and his designated status as a great hero by being on this list.
Okay, so name and status confirmed, but details absent in this specific material.
Got it.
Who's next on the list from verse 5?
Next up is Chiquitana.
Chiquitana. And how is he described? Similar to Diakatu.
Very similar, yes. The sources consistently place him within that same category. One of the great heroes, or one of the Mahabharas.
Okay, so he also gets that great hero designation based on his inclusion in verse 5?
Precisely. And again, the sources stress that he's listed with the others. They mention him alongside the Thakatu, the heroic king of Karshu, Purujit, Kuntapuja, and Sabya. It's about the group.
Right. His name appearing right there in that initial prominent list. That's what the sources say marks his importance as a great warrior.
Mm-hmm. His inclusion in this specific lineup is the main point the sources draw regarding his significance at this stage of the narrative. Being named here is the significance.
And like Diakatu, are there any specifics about his deeds?
No. Again, mirroring the treatment of Diakatu in these sources, they provide his name and his general status as a great hero, based on being on this list in verse 5.
But no stories of valor, no combat record within this material.
Not within the scope of the material we're examining. The focus stays tightly on who made it onto this foundational list mentioned in verse 5.
Yeah.
Not on, a detailed biography or blow-by-blow account of their battles.
Okay. Name number 3 on the list from verse 5, as highlighted by our sources.
This one's identified by his title, the King of Kashya. The King of Kaju.
The King of Kashya. Now, does he just get the standard great hero label?
Here's where it gets a bit more nuanced, according to the sources. He is on the list of great heroes, but he gets an additional specific descriptor.
Oh, what's that?
He's specifically described as valorous or heroic. The Telugu source uses Kahizagan Kasha, Duryodhana Kalijinava.
Valorous or heroic. Okay, that's different from just being called a great hero, and the sources dig into the original term, right?
They do. They highlight the Sanskrit term used in verse 5 for him.
Viryavan.
And the sources explain this means one who possesses valor, or simply heroic. So it's not just a general status, it's pointing to a specific defining quality.
That's really interesting. So unlike the first two we discussed, the King of Kashya isn't just important because he's on the list, he's singled out for his valor.
Exactly. The sources show how the different translations capture this specific quality.
How so?
Well, the Telugu translation and the sources puts it as Parakramashali Ainakasheraju. Heo Gosho. Which means
The valorous King of Kashya.
directly reflecting that Viryavan idea.
Okay.
And the English translation provided uses heroic king of Kush. Charles Kanausen that take a medical by idea.
So multiple translations, same core idea. This king is noted for his exceptional valor right from the get-go in verse 5.
Precisely. The sources emphasize that all these terms stem from Viryavan and consistently mark him out for this specific trait at the war's opening.
And he is, of course, listed alongside the others we've mentioned, Diakatu, Chiquitana, Purujit, Kuntapuja, and Sabya, confirming he's part of this core group in verse 5.
Absolutely. The sources present him as a key warrior, significant both for being on this list and for being explicitly recognized for his great valor right at this crucial narrative point.
Okay, that's a key distinction. Let's move on. Who's the 4th warrior named in verse 5, according to our sources?
Number 4 is Purujit.
Purujit.
And his description. Back to the standard great hero.
Yes. According to the sources discussing verse 5, Purujit falls into the same category as Diakatu and Chiquitana. He's explicitly included in this list and given the descriptors great hero, Kakoja, Gopavirju, and Mahavira visit Krekto.
So the sources clearly state he's one of the Mahaviras mentioned in this verse.
Correct. He's presented as another one of these foundational figures being highlighted right at the start.
And listed with the others. The sources note he's listed in the company of Dektu, Chekitana, the heroic king of Kashi, Kuntipoja, and Sibya in verse 5. That collective listing is consistently pointed out.
Okay. So his inclusion being named in this group by the text is what the sources mark as signifying his importance as a warrior. It's that act of naming him here.
Exactly. And again, sticking strictly to the source material provided for this deep dive.
Right, the constraints.
The sources identify Purajit by name and confirm his status as a great hero based on his presence in verse 5. But just like with Didekitu and Chikitana, they don't offer specific details about his battle actions, his history, or any unique feats.
Just the name and the great hero status from the list itself.
That's what the sources focus on for him in relation to verse 5.
Understood. Fifth warrior on the list from verse 5.
The fifth name our sources highlight from verse 5 is Kuntipoja.
Kuntipoja. Okay.
And the description for him in verse 5, as per the sources. For Kuntipoja, the sources are quite concise regarding verse 5. They simply state that he is included in this list of great heroes or Mahaviras.
So similar to Purajit then. His significance, as far as these sources interpret verse 5, comes directly from being named in this initial group of key figures.
That's the takeaway presented. He's important because the text puts him on this list right at the beginning.
And he's listed alongside
The same group. The Anthakatu, Chekitana, the heroic king of Kashu, Pujit, and Sibya. The sources mention his presence within this specific collective from verse 5.
Okay. So his presence there is what indicates his status as an important figure among the warriors, according to how the sources read this verse. It's that inclusion that matters here.
Exactly. And mirroring the others who only get the general great hero mentioned in this context?
Let me guess, no specific deeds mentioned in the sources for verse 5.
You got it. The provided source material, when discussing Kuntipoja in verse 5, gives us his name and confirms he's on the list of great heroes. But within the material we have, there are no extra descriptors, no details about his specific contributions or acts of valor.
Just his inclusion in the list.
The source's focus for him in verse 5 is squarely on that inclusion.
Okay. That brings us to the sixth and final warrior explicitly named in verse 5 according to the material we're looking at.
That would be Sobya.
Eusebia.
Sebia.
Right.
Now, is he just a great hero, or does he get a special mention like the King of Koja?
He gets a special mention, a very specific and quite unique descriptor, actually, highlighted by the sources.
Ooh, okay, what is it?
He is described as chief among men.
Yeah.
Chief among men. Wow, that sounds significant. Very high praise. Do the sources give the Sanskrit for that too?
They do, and it's a really powerful term. The Sanskrit word the sources emphasize for Sebia in verse 5 is Narapugava.
Narapugava.
And the sources explain it means chief among men, or perhaps even best among men. Some might translate it as bull among men, signifying preeminence and strength. It's a very strong epithet.
Okay, bull among men, chief among men, best among men. So he's not just a great hero like the others, or even specifically valorous like the King of Kashi. He's marked out for his overall eminence, his top-tier status among all men present.
That's exactly how the sources present it. This descriptor, Narapugava, elevates him significantly within the context of this verse. It sets him apart.
That's fascinating. A different kind of distinction. And he is, of course, part of the list.
Yes, the sources confirm he's listed right there in verse 5, alongside Dronacharya, Chekitana, the heroic king of Kashi, Purajit, and Kuntipoja.
So the sources show him as part of this key initial group, but they also really emphasize this unique high-status title, Narapugava, that's applied only to him in this list.
His significance, as conveyed by the sources analyzing verse 5, seems to stem from both his inclusion in the list and this very powerful specific descriptor highlighting his eminence.
And just to close the loop on him, any specific battle details or stories about why he's chief among men, according to the sources discussing verse 5?
Nope. Consistent with the pattern for the others, the sources give us his name, his inclusion in the great heroes list, and this incredibly potent descriptor, Narapugava. But based only on the material provided regarding verse 5, there are no specific details about his actions or the reasons for this title.
Just the title itself, applied right at the start.
Exactly. The focus remains intensely on the names and the labels used in the specific verse, right at the war's opening, as presented by our sources.
Okay, let's pause here for a second and try to bring this all together. We've gone through the 6 names highlighted by our sources from verse 5.
Dhyakatu, Chikatana, the king of Kashi, Purujit, Kuntibhoja, and Sebya.
And the core finding from these sources seems to be that this verse specifically identifies this group collectively as great heroes, or Mahavras, right at the outset of the Kurukshetra conflict.
Yes, the sources consistently hammer that point home. This specific group, identified in this single verse.
What strikes me, though, based on how you've laid out the source materials analysis, is the variation within the list.
You mean how some just get the great hero tag while others get something more specific?
Exactly. All 6 are important enough to be named as Mahaviras. But then the sources point out that the text in verse 5 gives the king of Kasha that extra valorous descriptor, Viravan. And Shubhya gets that even more elevated chief among men, Narapugava.
Right. It's not a uniform description for everyone on the list.
Which feels deliberate, doesn't it? I mean, why would the text, or at least the sources interpreting it this way, make those distinctions right here, right at the beginning?
That's a great question the sources implicitly raise by highlighting these specific terms. It suggests, perhaps, that while all 6 are indeed great warriors, there might be different kinds of greatness or prominence being acknowledged.
Like general heroism is the baseline for being on the list.
Maybe. And then specific outstanding qualities like valor, viryavan, or overall preeminence, Narapugava, get called out for particular individuals.
It adds layers to just a simple list of names. The sources, by focusing on who is listed and how they're described in verse 5, show us it's more than just a roll call.
Precisely. The sources emphasize identifying the individuals and the specific titles or descriptors assigned in this verse. They show it's a curated list, a deliberate highlighting of key figures.
And the varying descriptions, as pointed out by the sources, might hint at a hierarchy or maybe different roles or types of leadership and heroism recognized within the epic's framework, at least at this initial stage.
That could be one interpretation based on the distinctions the sources highlight within verse 5.
So really understanding this specific list from verse 5 with the exact names and the precise ways they are described or not described in detail gives you, the listener, a really valuable snapshot.
It does. It shows who the narrative, through this verse, wants you to notice right from the start. These are the figures meant to command attention as the battle lines are drawn.
It helps establish the sheer caliber of the warriors involved, doesn't it? Naming these players, applying these specific, sometimes unique titles.
It paints an immediate picture. A formidable array as presented by the sources analyzing this verse. Each marked for greatness, whether it's that general Mahavira status or exceptional valor, or being the chief among men.
And according to the sources, this careful selection and description in verse 5 really sets the tone, suggesting the scale and the epic nature of the conflict that's about to unfold.
That seems to be the implication drawn from the source material's focus on this verse.
Okay, so we've done a pretty deep dive there, sticking just to the source material provided, focusing intensely on Bhagavad Gita, verse 5.
Yeah, we've explored that specific list of 6 warriors, Dhyakatu, Chikitana, the king of Kashi, Purujit, Kuntibhoja, and Sebya.
Identified as great heroes, or Mahaviras, in the sources interpreting that verse, we've looked at their names, the specific descriptors applied, like valorous, Viryavan, and chief among men, Narapugava, and noted where the sources indicate a lack of further detail within this specific context.
And it really highlights how, even in the opening descriptions, the narrative is quite deliberate in selecting and characterizing key individuals. It gives us a glimpse, based on verse 5, into who is considered prominent and why.
So as we wrap up, here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on, sparked by this analysis of the source material. What does this very deliberate act, listing these specific 6 individuals by name, giving them these titles, sometimes quite unique ones, right at the very start of the battlefield description, what does that suggest about the story's priorities?
That's interesting. Like, what kind of message is being sent by highlighting these heroes described in these ways at this moment?
Exactly. How does this selective naming and description, which our sources focused on so carefully, shape your initial understanding of the forces involved? And maybe even what does it suggest about the different types of heroism or leadership that the epic values or wants us to notice from the beginning?
Yeah, what kind of heroes are being put front and center and why them? It's definitely something to ponder, based on the groundwork laid in just this one verse, as illuminated by the sources we looked at.
Food for thought. Well, thank you for joining us on this very focused deep dive into the source material.
Thank you. It's always fascinating to get to the details.